Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Lachlan by D.B. Reynolds, narrated by Julio Maxwell. Prologue. The Highlands of Scotland, 1846. Lachlan McRae woke on his first night to bloodshed and death. He lay on a rough bed in the deep, dark basement where all McRae vampires were left to rest after being turned. It was a clan tradition to turn the strongest of their warriors, a tradition so old that no one could say when it began. Lachlan was proud to have been chosen, but by all the saints, he ached in body and bone, the pain made worse by the small bed being such a poor fit for his long frame. But none of that mattered now. It was the sound of screams, the clash of blades that drew his gaze to the stone ceiling overhead. Minutes dragged by before he could force his reluctant body to move, as if his head didn't know how to control his legs and arms anymore. "What's happening, Lachlan?" He turned slowly at the sound of his cousin's groggy voice. "Don't know, Fergus," he managed, his mouth drier than bracken in winter. "But I'll be finding out. Is Monroe stirring yet?" "Aye," a scratchy voice responded. "I'm with you." Lachlan raised his head when everything went nearly silent up above. He'd have rather the sounds of battle than this ominous quiet. "Grab blades, soon as you can, lads," he murmured. "But stealth is the watchword. Follow my lead." His cousins didn't say a word. They didn't have to. They'd been following Lachlan's lead since the three of them had been babes barely able to crawl. Lachlan climbed the twisting stairs, footsteps silent despite his stature. He was a big man even by McRae standards, tall and broad both. But he'd always moved like a ghost through the heather, his uncle's favored scout, for all that you wouldn't know it to look at him. And now, with the newly born vampire gift coursing through his blood, he was quieter even than a ghost, and one hell of a lot faster. He paused at the basement door and glanced back. His cousins were right behind him, their eyes glowing red in the dim torchlight. He blinked at the unfamiliar sight and wondered if his own eyes were as bloody. The thought didn't last, as a furious roar rose over fresh screams from above. He pushed the round wooden door upward, hinges squealed, but the sound went unheard in the empty kitchen. Where was everybody? He could hear the renewed clash of blades from the courtyard, but the women and children should have been taking shelter here, deep within the fortress. It had been years since they'd endured any serious assault, but memories were long. The clans weren't a peaceful brotherhood. Friends could become enemies in a fortnight. All it took was a single setback, and they'd start looking beyond their borders for something better. And so, the women and children, who were the future of the clan, drilled as hard as the warriors, but their duty was to survive, not to fight. He shoved the overhead door all the way open, catching it just before it would have crashed to the floor. Most likely, there was no one to hear it, but his body acted without thought, aiming for stealth, just as he too had been taught since childhood. The three of them climbed into the kitchen, not yet as graceful as they were accustomed, but warming with every step. Following the growing sounds of battle, they made for the main passage, heading for the courtyard. They'd no sooner taken the first twisting turn than Lachlan froze, his gaze swinging to stare in disbelief at the heavy door that hung open on the resting place of the elder vampires of the clan, including their chief. But it wasn't the open door that made his breath catch in his lungs. His nostrils flared at the dusty scent. He didn't need his newly born vampire senses for this. It smelled like death. Vampire death. "Lachlan," Fergus whispered, his gaze following Lachlan's. "Is that?" "Aye, but we don't know who yet, so—" He paused. "Let's go." They found the first bodies next. Two McRae warriors, human, not vampire. The smell of their blood so strong that Lachlan could hardly think. He was a day-old vampire. He'd woken starving, and blood was blood. but he would not lick the death's blood of his own kin. He might be vampire now, but he was still a McRae. The next body was a woman, small with long dark hair covering her bloody face, arms clasped around a wee child who lay perfectly still. He went to one knee, heart in his throat, as he brushed the woman's hair aside. Fergus bit back a choked cry and pushed forward to kneel next to her, anguish creasing his face at the sight of his sister and her child. "Sarah." It was an agonized whisper, barely heard against the battle still raging outside. Lachlan forced himself to be practical, to shove down his own grief. His lovely, laughing cousin was dead, her barely born son along with her, but her spirit was screaming for revenge, not tears. He stood and offered Fergus his hand. "Come, laddie, we'll mourn her properly after we kill the bastards that did this. Their dead souls will pave her way into the paradise the priests prattle on about." Fergus's jaw clenched as he covered his sister's face with her shawl, then gripped Lachlan's hand with a grim nod, and stood. Discarding stealth, they raced for the courtyard. A quick glance showed an uneven battle as their remaining human cousins faced off against a band of vampires, wearing the Ross tartan. Lachlan roared as he waded into the battle. That the enemy was Clan Ross didn't surprise him. They'd been enemies of the McRae 100 years over, for all that they'd both kept the truce of their last bloody battle. What surprised him was that the Ross vampires had made it to the fortress this soon after sunset. Granted, he and his cousins were so newly made that the sun had set some hours past, but even so, the Ross vampires must have slept nearby to attack so quickly. It spoke to considerable planning, but it wasn't the secrecy that bothered Lachlan. It was the troublesome fact that the McRae guards set about during the day must have been killed before the fighting even started, for there was no way they could have missed this many fighters on their doorstep. But the dead could be tallied later. It was time to save those he could from an enemy so craven that he countenanced the killing of women and children, not to mention the slaughter of vampires in their daytime beds. Such acts could only be avenged with death. Lachlan rushed into the courtyard, breaking through to the front of the line with ease, stout McRae warriors moving aside without being asked, like water parting before him. It was an odd thing, but Lachlan didn't squander thought on it, as he hefted his broadsword and blocked a blade that would have beheaded a clansman. In the next moment, he dropped his metal shield and instead drew on his newfound vampire strength to wield a second blade in a deadly dance that laid waste to his enemies. Blood flew as the screams of Ross warriors joined the cacophony of battle, as vampire and human warriors alike fell to his blades. But these weren't the deaths he hungered for. His two swords rose and fell in a whirl of steel, but even as he fought, he scanned the ranks of his enemy, seeking the ones who were behind this cowardly attack, the ones who had to be there. His dark gaze locked on the man, the vampire he sought. Erskine Ross, who styled himself a vampire lord and thought he could rule all the highlands. McRae had no interest in that kind of an alliance, one that would set Ross above all others. Highlanders had long memories, and the Ross clan had a habit of turning on their friends as readily as their enemies. But their tendency toward perfidy had nothing to do with their strength. Erskine Ross, in particular, was a powerful vampire. He was also dishonorable enough to have devised this dastardly attack on sleeping vampires and on women and children. Blades whipping around him, Lachlan shoved his way through the crowd, careless of his own safety, determined to confront the black-hearted Erskine. The powerful vampire stood his ground, grinning as his gaze locked with Lachlan's, while around them the retreat sounded and the Ross fighters fled. Lachlan finally came within shouting distance of Erskine, the battle dying between them, blades dripping as they stared at each other. Erskine wasn't as big as Lachlan, but his tremendous vampire power made up for it, making him seem twice his size. Lachlan had power too, but he had barely begun to unleash it. He wasn't as weak as some he'd observed in the past, vampires who had to learn to walk again, much less to wield a blade. At some future date, he might even fight Erskine and win. But not this night. That didn't mean he'd bend his neck and surrender, however. "This will not stand, Erskine," he called as the field cleared. "McRae will have our revenge." The vampires to either side of the powerful Erskine snickered. "End him now, my lord," one of them drawled. "We killed the elders. Why leave this babe at our backs?" Erskine's grin became a laugh. "For my amusement," he said finally, his accent pure lordly English, as if he considered himself too high and mighty to speak his born tongue. "Look at him, he's so fresh. He still stinks of humanity. It will be entertaining to watch the great Clan McRae stumble and fall under his leadership, assuming he survives his first blood." He scoffed and started to turn his back on Lachlan. "You're right," Lachlan said. "McRae's revenge will not be soon, but it will come. And when it does, it will be my hand that ends you." Erskine shrugged. "Be a good lad, or we'll kill the others." Lachlan stiffened. "What others?" The self-styled vampire lord jerked his head at the lackey standing next to him. The man gave a loud whistle, and suddenly there was a shuffle of feet near the ruined front gate. He heard a chorus of soft cries, and then a dozen McRae females were shoved into the shattered opening, none of them older than 16, while the youngest was barely 10, clinging to her sister's waist. Lachlan had no siblings, but he had cousins aplenty, and he recognized every fierce scowl and tear-stained face. "You would do this cowardly thing, take women and children prisoner." Erskine Ross shrugged. "Hostages are common enough in war, as are slaves. But these will be treated well and released at the edge of McRae lands, as long as you mind your place." He smirked, then glanced at the sky. "Dark's a-wasting, and we've a fair ways to go," he said to his fighters, then paused to toss a warning over his shoulder. "Mind what I said, Lachlan McRae. Before the next new moon, I will be Scotland's first vampire lord. Your clan chief and his council refused to see it, so they had to die. But it will take every sword we can muster to defend our lands. Be smarter than they were. I would welcome your strength in the coming battle, but know this. I would just as easily wipe you from the earth if you continued to oppose me." Erskine gave him his back then, as if Lachlan was nothing. No threat, no warrior, nothing but a baby vampire with no power. He growled, muscles tensed, but Fergus stopped him with a hand on his arm. "It grinds my heart too, cousin, but you'll only get yourself killed, and we need you." Lachlan swung his head to stare at his cousin. "You think so little of my skills?" "Of course not," Fergus snapped. "But the fact remains, let the Arse think you weak. It will only help us when we finally kill him." Lachlan stared after the departing enemy, torn to the roots of his soul. "There's dead here what deserve a proper send-off, and someone has to organize a defense of the living," Monroe said somberly, walking up to join them. "Surely Taskill..." "Dead," he said flatly, "and the others with him. The faithless bastards began their attack in daylight. They arrived as human traders, 2 of them. One made his way into the elders' resting place and murdered everyone. We're all that's left, cousin. The 3 of us are the only McRae vampires still living." Lachlan stared. Granted, he'd known some vampires had died, but all of them? Taskill had been nearly 400 years old, and he'd led Clan McRae from the shadows for most of that time. If Lachlan and his 2 cousins were truly all that were left, why did Erskine Ross let us live? Grief made the words little more than a rasp of noise. "Why didn't he kill me?" "He said it himself," Fergus said grimly. "For one, he needs pure, tough warriors to keep the highlands in Scottish hands. But beyond that, he doesn't know you, cousin. He doesn't see your strength not only to wield a blade, but to lead. He believes this is the end of Clan McRae as anything but a memory. But he's wrong. If it takes 2 years or 2 centuries, you will rebuild Clan McRae, and when that happens, revenge will be ours. Chapter 1. Washington, D.C., present day. Julia Harper shoved her water bottle into the curve of her elbow, holding it above her purse as she dug in a pocket for her key, and didn't find it. Shit, she cursed softly, and switched everything to her other arm to dig into the opposite pocket. She kept telling herself she was going to put the damn key on her key ring, but she hadn't yet. She'd only moved in last week, and there was a mountain of higher priority tasks demanding her attention. Finally, finding the elusive little sucker, she shoved it into the lock and pushed into her townhouse, letting the door slam behind her. The 4-bedroom townhouse was too big for her, but her dad and his accountant had insisted she needed a bigger tax write-off, whether she needed the extra bedrooms or not. It was either that or pay more taxes, her dad had explained, and because she trusted him, especially when it came to the substantial family trust that he managed, she bought a townhouse she never could have afforded on her salary as a cubicle dweller for the CIA. Some of her colleagues, knowing she came from old money, had asked why she was working for the CIA at all. She usually brushed it off with some comment about needing something to do, but the truth was that she'd joined the CIA for the challenge of working as a field agent. She'd almost gotten there, too. But that was a story for another time, a time when she wasn't wearing workout clothes that were still damp with the sweat she'd earned in the dojo that night, trying to keep up the fighting skills she'd learned before her dream died. Shivering, she hurried to her upstairs bedroom, stripping off damp clothes as she went. When she hit her bedroom, she tugged off her pants and socks and dumped the entire disorderly bundle of clothes into the hamper. But with her mother's gentle voice still clear in her head, one of the few distinct memories she had to cling to, she dutifully slid her shoes neatly onto the closet shelf designated for athletic shoes and headed for the bathroom. She turned on the hot water first, letting it fill the room with warm, wet heat. She could feel her pores drinking in the moisture, like a dried mushroom soaking in wine. Stepping under the spray, she simply stood for a while, loving the heat, the pounding of water on tired muscles. When she found herself nearly nodding off, she washed her pale blonde hair, slathered on some body wash, then did a quick rinse and turned off the water. By the time she left the bathroom for her bedroom, she had a towel on her head and was wrapped in an oversized terry bathrobe. She was just considering whether to skip dinner and go straight to bed when her cell gave a distinctive ring. Surprised, she crossed to the side table where she'd left her phone. There'd been a time when she'd heard that ring several times a day, but she and Masood had had a falling out a couple months ago. She hadn't heard from him since, and she missed him. He was her oldest friend in the world. They'd always been close, but after her mother and brother had been killed in a car accident when she was a child, she and Masood had become even closer. They'd grown up together, even when their parents' jobs had taken them far apart. He'd been her best friend, the one person she could always talk to, until she'd discovered that he thought what they had was much more. "Hey," she said, answering. "Did you finally get tired of refusing my calls?" "Julia!" His voice was hushed and tight, with some emotion she'd never heard from him before. "Masood? What's happening?" The emotion was fear, and not simple fear, but something much more. "I don't have time," he said, but not impatiently, more like he really meant it. "I need you to do something for me." "Anything but tell me what's going on. Where are you?" Dread crept up her spine. She'd known Masood bin Abu almost her entire life, and she'd never heard him like this. "London," he said shortly, giving her the first real piece of information since she'd answered the phone. "Meeting a client, but it went bad, Jules. Very bad." He practically whispered the last 2 words. Julia's chest squeezed, her heart in her throat, as she asked, Where in London do you need the embassy? I'm trying to get there, he confirmed, and for the first time she paid attention to the sounds of traffic behind his voice. Damn it, Masood, don't be walking in the open. Get a fucking cab. Don't swear, he said absently, as if he'd told her the same thing 1,000,000 times, which he had. I'm only a block away. That told her two things. First, he was aiming for the Saudi embassy, which was in an expensive neighborhood of London not far from the palace and lots of other embassies. Masood had dual citizenship, but the U.S. embassy was some distance, on the other side of the river. He wouldn't be going there if he was in a hurry. But she also knew he was lying. She could hear it in his voice. He had more than a single block to go. Masood, grab a cab. They're everywhere in that— Listen, he said urgently. I need to tell you this. Go to my house. You have a key. In my office, you know the safe. Of course, but the combination is our numbers. You remember? Yes, but there's a blue expandable file in there. Erskine Ross. That's the name. The folder has a few written notes, but also 2 flash drives. Make sure you get those. They have all the docs, all my notes on the data trail. Data trail? What are you talking about? Money laundering, I think. I should have turned it over to enforcement, but I wanted to be sure. He's a big client, very high profile. Been with the firm for years. I wanted to be wrong. The words were tumbling out, and he was breathing heavily now, as if he was running. Put that file somewhere safe. You understand? She understood all right. Masood wasn't supposed to know she worked for the CIA, but he did. He was too smart to fool for long, and besides, she trusted him. He wanted her to take this blue file to her office in Langley and lock it up. Masood, please, are you safe? Don't know. Don't think so, not yet. The words were distracted, forced out on heavy breaths. Be careful. Don't let anyone know. He's a vampire. What? Who? Erskine Ross. He's a vampire. What the hell, Masood? You're scaring me. I don't want— Julia, he said, his voice suddenly unnaturally calm and even, as if he'd stopped running. I love you, Habibi. Don't ever forget that. The squeal of tires and gunshots. Later, she'd remember there were 3 shots. But in that moment, all she could hear was the sound of Masood's pain as he grunted into the phone, the dull thud of his body hitting the ground, the crack of his cell phone falling to the sidewalk. Masood! She screamed his name over and over until finally the phone cut off with the crunch of a heavy boot. Chapter 2. London, England, 6 months later. Julia sipped her whiskey, eyes raised over the rim of her glass to watch the young woman sitting across the table. I couldn't believe it when Fergus called, Katrina McRae nattered cheerfully. I mean, what are the chances that all these years later someone would be asking me about sin? Pretty slim, Julia thought, worried about the coincidence that some vampire in Scotland would be nosing around about her friend Cynthia Layton just as she arrived in London to investigate Masood's death. She stifled the shock of pain that still touched her heart every time she thought about him. She couldn't believe he was dead, that she'd never have a chance to hug him again, to smooth over the pain they'd caused each other before he died. She knew coming to London was a long shot. She was no hotshot investigator. She couldn't even count on the cooperation of local authorities, since she had no official standing. In fact, if anyone bothered to dig out the fact that she worked for the CIA, they'd be investigating her instead of Masood's death. She took another sip of whiskey. She was the one who'd agreed to this meeting, but that didn't ease the combination of suspicion and curiosity at a call from someone she hadn't seen in ages. Someone who'd been a little too interested in Cynthia Layton. She herself had been speaking to Sin almost daily since Masood's death. She'd needed to learn about vampires, and how to find one particular vampire in a country she barely knew, and Sin happened to be mated to the most powerful vampire in North America, which brought up one more chance connection, that Sin had suggested Julia reach out to Kat, and that was simply too many coincidences. So she'd agreed to Kat's out-of-the-blue invitation, though she'd insisted on a public location in a hotel that was very protective of its guests. Katrina, pronounced Katrina, though everyone at school had simply called her Kat, had been a year behind Julia and Sin at the French prep school they'd all attended. Students there had hailed from all over the world, but with one thing in common. Their families had enough money to afford the privacy and security the school offered, while also delivering a first-rate education and an international cultural experience. But Kat had stood out even in a school population that included its share of royal offspring, both European and Hollywood, mostly because she'd made no secret of the vampires in her family tree. At the time, Julia had figured at least half of Kat's stories were fictional, but it was the other half that had made her consider Sin's suggestion seriously. So there Julia had been, looking for a rich and powerful vampire, wondering how she could possibly find him, thinking about calling Kat, when suddenly Kat reached out first, saying her vampire cousin wanted to talk to her, supposedly because he needed an inside line to Raphael. Julia didn't know much about vampires other than what she'd learned from Sin and her own research over the past 6 months. She'd discovered Erskine Ross was reported to be the big boss of all Scotland's vampires, the so-called Scottish Vampire Lord, though she hadn't managed to find a single picture of him other than a distant profile that was so blurry she wouldn't have recognized him on the street. But the fact that he was the ruling vampire begged the question of why another wealthy vampire, which she assumed Kat's cousin to be given the family money which had qualified her for the French prep school, would need anyone to serve as a go-between if he wanted to talk to Raphael. The timing and the facts just didn't ring true. But she couldn't pass up the chance. If Kat's cousin was on the up-and-up, he might be very useful to her own investigation, and if all it took to secure his help was a phone call to Sin, well, hell, she could do that, although she'd want to know why first. After all, Sin was a good friend, while Kat's cousin was not only a stranger, but a vampire. And it was vampires who'd killed Masood. She knew it, even if no one else believed her. Of course, that might be because she hadn't shared Masood's files with anyone, not even his father. Hell, especially not his father. There was too much money involved. Masood had gone against his father's dictates most of his life. The two had never been close, a situation which had only worsened as Masood got older. He'd never trusted his father enough to make him a part of his life, and there was no way in hell she was going to trust him with his death. She knew without asking that his father would never pursue Masood's killer if it meant losing a lot of money. "Of course, I've kept up with Sin from afar," Kat was chattering on. "Can you imagine Madame Martle's reaction when she heard that Cynthia Layton had hooked up with—" She lowered her voice to a whisper. "A vampire?" She laughed. "And not just any vampire, but the big honcho himself, Raphael." Julia nodded agreeably. Old Pinchface probably had a severe case of the vapors. She smiled despite herself at the not-so-secret nickname that her fellow students had all used for the headmistress at their very elite prep school. At the same time, she gave her phone a casual scan to check the time, wondering when Kat's curious cousin was going to show. He was already overdue, which made her nervous. She'd been very careful in her investigations, but if someone wanted to shut her down, she'd be an easy target. Glancing up when there was a stir around the entrance to the Tony Bar, her gaze sharpened, every bit of her training and instinct telling her this could be very, very bad. A man stood just inside the wide doorway, a slight bulge under his leather jacket, betraying the weapon concealed there. Tall and broad with long black hair and eyes that scanned the crowd with careful precision. His gaze lingered on the most crowded tables, as if assessing the risk, or calculating the death toll. "Kat," she said in a quiet voice, "when I give the word, I want you to hit the floor. Don't ask questions. Don't panic. Just duck under the table." Katrina gave her a puzzled look. "Why would I—" "Just do it," Julia hissed, seeing the man begin to make his way between the tables. Kat, of course, ignored her warning, standing instead, her gaze lifted over the heads of their fellow drinkers as if searching for whatever had set Julia off. Julia cursed silently. This was no time for gawking. Damn, Kat was going to get them both killed. "Over here," Katrina called suddenly, laughing as she lifted both arms and hugged Well, fuck. Julia closed her eyes briefly, feeling stupid. The leather-clad gunman was Kat's vampire cousin? He sure is.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?